Hello and welcome back to The Vacant Light. Today I'm back with another video review, and I'm covering Azaghal's Omega. Now, if you're not familiar with Azaghal, which I'm assuming many of you are not, Azaghal is a black metal band from Finland, and many of you may know that I do love the Finnish black metal. This is a band I was not really that familiar with prior to importing this album as part of my last shipment from Northern Heritage Records in Finland, and this was released in 2008. Even now, this is not the band's most recent album, but it's a very interesting listen nonetheless, and I'd like to talk about it a little bit today. Now, Azaghal is a black metal band that combines traditional black metal elements with a more aggressive and technical approach to their music. And technicality is not something that many of us attribute to the black metal style of music, which makes this album quite an interesting and creative listen. Now, the vocals are very interesting in the fact that they combine a traditional element of the old school black metal style with a more aggressive and depraved influence coming into that. In particular, I found that there was a little bit more experimentation here than on some of the prior black metal albums I've listened to in the past. There was some experimentation with double tracking and some experimentation also with unusual singing styles here and there, but really what you're going to get is a meat and potatoes combination of traditional black metal vocals with that depraved, depressive style. Moving on to the guitar work, which in my opinion was a little bit more prominent than the vocal work on this album. I really felt that the guitars did a great job of combining a number of different approaches in the songwriting and actual implementation here. The first thing you'll notice is that the opening track is extremely aggressive and technical. You'll hear a lot of sort of arpeggiated note progressions, and also a lot of fast-paced aggression in that music there, as well as the technicality of the actual riffs themselves is pretty top-notch, and again, not very traditional in that sense. However, on other songs, particularly later in the album, you'll hear more of a mid-paced, kind of a sludgy vibe to the music. You can almost hear specifically a groove-oriented style, and I really found that the diversity between those two different aspects of the music made this quite an interesting listen. In addition to that groove-oriented style, you will hear a little bit of the traditional, old-school kind of second wave of black metal tremolo riffing here, and that does fit in quite well, and works well with the other instruments going on here. Overall, I'd like to say that I felt that the technical parts of the album were the most interesting on first listen, particularly because they used 2 guitar tracks to the highest extent. However, I felt that all the different vibes and influences were quite well represented here, and the more groove-oriented and old-school style riffs on this album became more and more apparent and enjoyable on subsequent listens. Now, moving on to the bass work, I'd have to say for me the bass is actually the low point on this album, and not because it's particularly bad or anything like that. I just felt that it wasn't mixed high enough and wasn't prominent enough in the actual mix itself, and in the songwriting, just in general. Now, what I would like to say is that the bass does do a quite good job of sort of filling in the gap between the technicality of the guitar work and and also the mid-paced riffs you find there with the technicality of the drumming. There are a couple moments where you can hear a more growly, very abrasive vibe to the bass work itself, but for the most part it's fairly rich sounding and warm when you do hear it in that mix. The drumming is actually really one of the highlights for me as well. I felt that even though the guitars moved between more aggressive and technical, and also into more groove-oriented, slower, sort of more mid-paced kind of stuff, I felt that the drumming always kept that level of aggression to it, and was oftentimes more busy sounding than the actual guitar work. I felt that in the more aggressive sections here, the drummer was able to use the bass, snare, and cymbals quite well to add that thick layer of aggression to the music. In addition to that, the toms came in really well on the fills, and also in the more some of the more mid-paced sections, although the guitars tend to be more mid-paced than the drums themselves. Overall, I did like the sound as well to the drums. It was fairly crisp sounding, not too muffled, and I could make out the different parts there quite well, which I really liked. I'd like to say that in general about this album as well. This is not really what I consider a low-fidelity black metal album. It's more of a mid, sort of moderate fidelity release, and that level of technicality works well with the production style used here. I didn't feel that anything was really too muffled or really drowned out, with the exception of the bass in certain parts. Now, the other interesting thing that the band did use was a bit of actual keyboards. And the keyboards ranged from more of a blending in kind of approach to a more ambient, a more distinctly audible kind of sound, particularly used in song introductions and sort of bridge sections. Now, I really did feel like even when the keyboard sounds were more obvious, I felt that they blended in quite well. In particular, I felt that when the guitars were being very fast-paced and the synth and keyboard effects were really following up on that regard, I felt that the music really felt very complex, very technical, but had a very tangible appeal to it. And what I'd like to say about this album in general is that I was really blown away by this. This is something that I think will appeal to people who like the black metal, but also like that modern approach to it. And also, as a fan of the old school stuff, I didn't really feel alienated at all. I felt that there was a good amount of aggression. Those traditional elements can still be heard, but this is very much a unique and creative approach to this sort of music. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, I felt that the more technical parts were very interesting, and really I could grip onto those quite easily on the first listen. Like, the first track was my main highlight on the first listen, and although I'd say it's still probably my favorite on the album, I definitely heard more appeal in the second half, particularly on third, fourth, fifth listens and so on. So it did grow on me, and that level of diversity on this album makes it such a great release, because you can listen to it multiple times and have different parts of that sort of diversity appeal to you, depending on your mood and depending on how familiar you are with the music. Additionally, I'd like to say that the songwriting is really top-notch. The riffs have a very immediate appeal to them, and do still allow some growth in your memory and in your recollection of them over time. So I wouldn't say that anything on here is really alienating to really any fan of this sort of music in general. So do check out this band. Take your time to check them out. They're called Azaghal from Finland. They've actually been around for quite a while, and I'm surprised I haven't really heard more about them. So thanks a lot for watching this, and I do highly, highly recommend this album. Thanks and goodbye.